Today I've got quite an interesting lens here, both because it's a super wide angle, full frame fisheye lens and because it's got an awesome build quality and image quality for just over $200. It comes in Canon RF, Leica L, and Nikon Z mounts, as well as this Sony E-Mount that I've been testing. We'll look at both the design and the image quality in this video, so let's get into it. Hey, what's up? I'm Scott and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for more no-nonsense tutorials and reviews. So as far as the basics go, this is an 11mm full frame fisheye lens. It's all metal and all manual. There's no electronic contacts at all and no weather sealing. It goes from f2.8 to f16 with a declicked manual aperture ring and has distance markings on the focus ring in both feet and meters. There's a tiny built-in lens hood around the rounded front element with a slip-on style metal lens cap, a 7-blade aperture, a 6.7-inch minimum focus distance, and it all comes in at just under 1 pound. Taking a bit of a closer look, holding the lens in your hand, you might be surprised how hefty it feels in a good way. Both in its weight and in its use, it does not feel like a cheap lens at all. The only signs of what I guess you could call cheapness are that there's no weather sealing and there's no electronic contacts for communication with the camera. But that's pretty typical for manual lenses like this. Starting at the back, of course, the mount is all metal. The whole lens is, and when you move the focus ring, the rear element does move in and out a little bit, but you can never see any large gaping space inside of the lens. It has a nice and tight and confident fit on my Sony a7R IV, and it actually feels really nice and balanced in the hand. So moving up the lens, you have some branding and some markings on the lens here, and again, as you can see, this is an 11mm lens, but if you use it on a crop sensor camera or the APS-C crop mode on the a7R IV, for example, you get something around a 16.5mm field of view, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the image quality section. After that is the aperture ring. Again, this is declicked, and it has a really smooth and nicely weighted movement. Honestly, it's one of the best feeling aperture rings that I've used, especially on a photo lens. It goes from f2.8 to f16 with full stop markings on the barrel. And remember, there are no contacts on here, so the aperture information will not get fed into your camera. But if you are using something like the Sony cameras with focus peaking, that still works, and it does make manual focusing a little bit easier. So speaking of that, next up is the focus ring. Again, it's all metal with a bumpy texture to it for grip. And once again, it's weighted really nice with very smooth resistance and a very good feel overall for manual focusing. You have your markings on here for your depth of field at different apertures, as well as, again, distance markings in both meters and feet, which I appreciate living in Japan, having gotten used to using distance in meters. With such a wide angle lens, manual focus is generally much easier. As you can see by the markings on the lens, for example, at f4, you could easily focus from about 3 feet all the way to infinity. At 2.8, of course, that depth of field does become a bit narrower, and especially as you focus down under 1 meter, you'll start to blur the background more and more, all the way down to 6.7 inches from the sensor, which is actually only about 3 inches from the front glass element. So speaking of getting in close, the lens barrel does move in and out just a few millimeters as you go from infinity down to minimum focus, which, by the way, is just about a 90-degree turn, or just over 90 degrees turn of the focus ring. Anyway, that front glass is slightly curved outwards, which means there's no filter thread on here, and the glass goes almost edge to edge with a very tiny petal-shaped lens hood permanently attached. As I mentioned before, you do have this slip-on style lens cap here, and again, this feels very high quality. I mean, I've used other lenses with lens caps like this before, and I've got to say, this feels much nicer. It slides on smoothly, but it does hold on pretty tight, and it will definitely not come off too easily, which is a very good thing. So again, it's a lens cap, but it does feel down to the very last little detail that they put a lot of effort into making this very high quality lens. All in all, build quality alone, this is already a killer lens for the price, but of course, let's take a quick look at some of the image quality tests as well. Now, testing a fisheye lens is, of course, a little bit different, a little bit more difficult than a traditional lens, but we're going to go through what we can. And I tested this on the Sony A7R4, which is a very high megapixel camera, so it's very demanding of lenses, and little imperfections are a lot more visible. But again, this still did very, very well. So as much as possible, without being too picky about it, we're going to dive through some different categories in terms of image quality. Also keep in mind that because there are no contacts on this lens that communicate with the camera, I have no information about what settings I was using. So for the most part, things like aperture, I'm going from memory. Some of them, of course, the more critical shots, I did make a point to remember what settings I was using. But for some of the shots in between, of course, my memory may be a little bit off if it was 5.6 or f8 or somewhere in between there, where exactly it was at. But you'll get the idea. So center sharpness is very impressive, I found, even wide open. More than enough detail on a demanding camera like the A7R4. Moving away a bit, the edges do of course drop off a bit in sharpness, but still respectable, I think, for a lens that stretches your image this much. And of course the corners are not sharp wide open, but I don't think they're really meant to be. Looking at this picture here, for example, I think the image is more than sharp enough right out to about where the grass ends, and from there it does drop off bit by bit. When you stop down a couple of stops to 5.6 or so, you actually get very good results out of most of the frame, except of course for those extreme corners. Looking at the same picture, you can see that there may be a little bit of chromatic aberration here and there toward the edges and the corners, but it's actually very well controlled. As you can also see in this picture, flare can definitely show up in your shots, and it did in a good number of mine, most often as a kind of red arc on one side of the image or the other. Sometimes smaller bits of ghosting showed up here or there, but as clearly defined as that flare could often be, I really didn't mind it all that much in a lens that already has this much unique character. Also, while it's not directly related to flare, as you stop down you can see that you do also get pretty decent sun stars, at least in my opinion, and I have to say that again, personally, I overall thought this lens had a really nice look to it in terms of color and contrast, at least without looking at it too clinically. So this is a super wide angle lens, and typically you wouldn't expect to blur the background too much with a lens like this, but with a fairly close minimum focus you can get some bokeh, and it looks pretty decent. The bokeh balls do have a little bit of a strong outline to them, but generally they're clean and nicely shaped. Otherwise, maybe you could consider it a little bit busy, but we really shouldn't sit here and analyze this too much from an 11mm fisheye lens. At closest focus though, center sharpness again is pretty impressive, and without testing it too scientifically, you can definitely get more than enough detail again on the 61 megapixel sensor of the A7R4. You can see all the dry skin on my hand, more than you want to, I'm sure. Now, especially at or near minimum focus, you won't get much sharpness outside of the center, so if you're using it at closest focus, you should probably keep your subject fairly close to the middle. Well, is it really called distortion when it's on purpose? When you have straight lines in your photos, you obviously get an incredible amount of distortion, that fisheye effect. But if you're careful, you can actually frame up certain shots to really minimize the effect. Mostly just keep the straight lines away from the edges, and especially at further distances, the effect becomes less and less noticeable. Now, especially if you're on a crop sensor or if you crop into your image, a little bit of technique can actually turn this into a decently normal wide angle lens at about 16.5 millimeters. Of course, there still is a high level of distortion, so be careful with those lines, but it is more versatile than you think. So I was actually really surprised with how much fun I had with this lens. My first thoughts were, fisheye, that'll barely get used, but honestly, going out with it, I had a lot of fun, and I feel like it was easier than I expected to find fun and interesting compositions, both using that close focus to exaggerate the effect, or just for framing up slightly unique shots, making the world around you look a lot larger. It does have its challenges, of course. Be careful of your lines, not only where they are, but that they're straight, because I feel like this will definitely be more noticeable in a lens like this when they're not. And while manual focus can be pretty easy on such a wide angle lens, it is something that does take a little bit of practice if you're new to it, especially as you get in close with those wider apertures. Overall, I definitely would not say this lens is a lens that you need in your kit, but if you have a little bit of money to spare on something that's fun and can help you be creative, I don't think it's something that you'll regret either. I feel like they priced it just right to be not too out of reach for most users, and at the same time they could still put enough into it that the lens is very premium feeling and very high performing. Honestly, it's a very good balance, and I've really enjoyed this lens. But as always, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them down below and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, if you liked this video or found it helpful, please consider giving it a thumbs up, sharing, subscribing if you're not already, all that good stuff, and I'll see you next time.